Hello and welcome back to Divine Dialogue with Dahlia. I am back with one of my favorite people, Kristin Turner. And today we are talking about being a spiritual person in a material world. Now, if this is your first time joining, first time watching, you found me on the internet, welcome again. This is a show where we talk about everything connected to divinity, interesting topics. The idea is to expand your mind, expand your heart, and really make you think. And so, with all of that, I am your host, Dahlia Rose. You'll see me periodically when I'm not. I don't know, spiritual people are spacey, so I'm usually out in some other dimension or just at home with my children, which is its own experience. And I want to introduce you again in case they didn't catch the other episode that you were with us, Kristin. So please tell us a little bit about yourself,
Oh,
other than
wow.
you're my favorite person.
Oh my gosh, like literally, this is like a Stan account essentially. But I am Kristen. I have been a client turned friend of Dahlia's for about maybe 3 or so-ish years. And we pretty much had a pretty instantaneous, like,
It was.
familiarity, connection. And even though, interestingly enough, I feel like we met during a period where I was definitely like having one of my dark nights of the soul. And I was definitely like
Mm.
kind of like grappling with a lot of like transition and just trying to kind of figure out like how to find purpose, amidst like the noise. And so it was a very timely meeting. And ever since then, I think we've really just connected on just the different ways of digging into your spirituality and like kind of
Absolutely.
rejecting this idea of like it's very cookie cutter and like the standardization of it. And I think that being able to have a sounding board as you kind of like explore the contours of what your own relationship to spirit is has been really helpful for me. And so I think it has not only allowed me to develop my own, more intuitiveness and more confidence in my intuition, but I think it's also allowed me to develop more vocabulary and assign better language to the things that I experience in my relationship to kind of like all of it. And so I am always down to have these conversations because I feel like half of the problem in the world, in this crazy world that we're living in right now, is that, we have been torn away from our intuition in so many senses and kind of like conditioned to seek external kind of validation and guidance when like really like it's kind of like our internal compass that should control. And so if my story or my reflections on what my path has been are helpful to other people, I'm more than happy to be there and also just use it as an excuse for us to kiki.
Well, and this is a perfect segue into everything that we're talking about today because spirituality, like you said, it's its own unique path for each individual person. And yes, your story is valuable because not only have we been torn away from our intuition, but we've been torn away from each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so, especially in our community, you don't talk about these things. This is
Mm-hmm.
the devil's work, and this is, there's so many negative connotations that come with the inward journey because you're supposed to externalize that relationship
Mm-hmm.
that you have with the divine. You're supposed to, deal with one male deity that, doesn't like it when you don't pay attention to him.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same sentence, like, you come from him, but you're not good enough to be,
Yeah.
you know, just like him, and you're always apologizing, and that's sort of the relationship that can happen. And that's not to say that's across the board for every religion. There's some. I think religion has its place,
Mm-hmm.
and we've had that discussion before.
Totally.
Um, but in this conversation of materialism and spirituality, where I stand with all of it is sort of in, I would say, the middle of the road as far as like needing to find your own level of appropriateness.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
our material world kind of consists of, going out, having the things, buying the things. There's a lot of, at least in America, things are centered around status and,
Yeah.
and and having being in a certain position,
Yeah.
and in order to be deemed valid, worthy, like you've
Mm-hmm.
made it, kind of thing. And I'm curious to know how you view materialism as far as the conversation is concerned.
Totally. Um, so my background originally is actually in the arts when I was like younger and a kid, but then like
I
it
can
kind
see
of
that.
it's like I grew up a dancer, I grew up around, you know, yes, the discipline of the arts, but also just like the creativity of the arts. And it's funny now that I'm older, I was telling somebody the other day, like my first experiences with meditation were actually in dance, and like I didn't
Yeah.
when I was younger, I didn't have, the vocabulary or the awareness to understand that like that was the experience. Um, but I think it was also like being around people who were used to being characters. And something about
Okay.
that really taught me about like the license that people have to show up as the main character in their own life. And I think as I
Right.
got older, I pursued kind of like the traditional paths of like, of schooling and college and postgraduate work and, very much so an academic orientation to the world, one that was like, more so buttressed by, kind of like accolades or kind of like what boxes you could check. And I think, especially when I was in grad school, the value was just so heavily placed on kind of like what you look like on paper.
Mm.
Um, and I really just started to have this like very inconvenient, let me just start by saying, typically awakenings happen at inconvenient times.
Oh, for sure.
You know what I mean? Like very inconvenient crisis of consciousness where I was just like, is this all that, like we're meant to do? And also like we all look the same on paper because you're telling us to all pursue the same things. And like, how does this make sense? And so it became one of those things where it was almost like a fire alarm going off inside that was just kind
Mm.
of like, there has to be more, just a suspicion. Like sometimes I think people think awakenings happen overnight. It's like a car accident or whatever. And I'm like, no, sometimes it's just an ember of a,
Yep.
like it's a suspicion that maybe there's a more expanded version of your life, And I think that like
Absolutely.
people are so trained to disregard that. And for some reason, mine just wouldn't go away. And so I think it was like, yeah, like, about to get this cool degree, you know what I mean? Blah, blah. Maybe I should go make some money, da, da, da. And while all of those things, made other people very interested in my experience, I couldn't help but feel like, you know, it was a betrayal of myself. Like I just no longer felt fulfilled or like I was stepping up to the purpose of my life. And so I think that I heard a really interesting quote recently and it just really tied back. But it was like, you think about materialism and it's like getting things and all those, blah, blah, blah. And in a moment, especially like right now that we're living in where it's a lot of noise and things like that, like, yeah, you can have the money, you can do those things. And yes, it affords you a certain level of security. But like in the unpredictability of the world right now, the biggest blessing is to feel a sense of safety within yourself. And to me, that
Absolutely.
is what my spirituality affords me. My spirituality affords me to still feel anchored amidst confusion. It still allows me to court joy amidst dejection. It allows me to have some space between like what I understand is going on in the world and the waves that are hitting our boats, you know what I mean? But also feeling like I'll be able to kind of cut a path through, assuming that I maintain my relationship to myself. And so I think it has been about discovering that like my goal in life as I kind of like move towards whatever iteration of my larger purpose I'm here to do. But like the only real charge I have right now is maintaining my relationship to myself because that will allow me to thrive in any condition.
And this is so we were talking a little bit before the show, and you asked me, do you ever feel intuitively that you know things are about to,
Yeah.
shit's about to hit the fan, and and what you just described is how I motion through that sort of sense. I mean, to have the ability, we all have that ability because we're all connected to the collective consciousness. So when you wake up, I can remember the Baltimore riots, and um, when that happened, I was living in Crofton, Maryland, which was
Mhm.
about 40 minutes away, and I just woke up, seething angry, and
Yeah.
but I couldn't grapple with where it was. I couldn't grasp where it was coming from,
Yeah.
and so how that translated, I was just getting into spirituality around that
Mhm.
time, and so it looked like reconnecting with myself. It looked like grabbing my crystals, working with my oracle decks, and it wasn't like tell me the future. It was help me understand what's going on inside of me. And this
Yeah,
is where I think materialism does have its place in spirituality, but not in the same sense of like the consumerism that takes place in every other venue of life.
totally.
So being a crystal purveyor myself, a whole shop
Yeah, yeah,
in
yeah, yeah, yeah.
in Woodbridge for 4 years, I have been telling people like I'm not a good salesperson because
Hmm.
I will tell you you don't need that stone.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
mean, I have people come in and they're like, "Hey, my life sucks. What crystal can I get
Hmm.
for that?" And I'm like, "Hey, have you tried meditation?
Yeah.
Have you tried getting a new job? Have
Yeah.
you tried setting boundaries? Have you
Hmm.
tried asking for help from the people that are supposed to be helping you? Have you tried bringing more authenticity into your
Yeah,
life
totally.
and letting it expand further than a few weeks
Yeah, totally.
and seeing the results of that as opposed to one of the big things that was going on in the beginning of, well, I won't name the time because I'm displaced. I'm so terrible with time. But there was a trend going on for a period of time where people were running out and getting certain crystals for certain purposes based on what they saw on YouTube,
Yeah.
TikTok, or otherwise.
Right.
And what they were coming to realize, which is exactly what spirituality will show
Hmm.
you, is that it doesn't work that
No, it's
way.
not
For
cookie cutter.
some people, it was an expansive experience. They were like, oh, yeah, life got better. And then for the people who were trying to outrun their trauma,
Hmm.
those crystals drew that energy to them faster and
Yeah,
was like, all right, we're going to fast track this healing. They were like, wait, that's not what I signed up for.
totally.
And so that's where I think materialism, being in a material world, can kind of diverge from spirituality
Totally.
because unlike in the material world where you get something to treat the symptom,
Hmm.
spirituality is going to call you to treat the cause.
Exactly. 100%. And it's like, even though people can intuit that there is something off about their life that they're trying to fix, what bothers me a lot is like, especially in materialism, it's like, okay, well, I'll just like get something to kind of put a band-aid on the wound for sure, but
Yeah,
it's also like the lack of people's belief in agency. Materialism teaches us that, like, you know what I mean, like that we are really not the ones responsible for our joy. And that
right. And
is the key, like, to me, that like really is troubling, because it's like, no, like, not only are we the ones responsible, but like we have full license to like act on it, and to kind of like create the changes, whether it's within ourselves or within our regular lives. And so I think that like so much of making that distinction has led to me kind of like really like being able to feel like, all right, like it's really crazy. It's really crazy. You know what I mean? But
yeah,
like my little, astronaut bubble, my little astronaut suit feels good because I at least am able to deploy the agency around kind of like what my immediate kind of like energy feels like, who I'm engaging with, and also get to the root of, the fears that I harbor that creates the anxiety, that tells me that like things are not, okay, and so like,
yeah,
I think I think I said this in the last one, but so many of the issues we're facing as a larger society are because we're not conditioned to have candid conversations with ourselves.
mm,
And so it's like that's why we're like really struggling to come to the table and like haggle over these different issues. It's because we don't even have a social contract in place that tells us that like admitting failure or admitting shortcoming or saying that maybe there is an alternative isn't taboo. Like we still live in a place where it's like that's like hush hush, you shouldn't say that. Where it's like, no, in my mind, that's the whole ball game. The whole ball
right.
game is like we are sitting here trying to navigate an inherently imperfect human experience, and also like walk away from this experience with an evolved soul that like has felt both the joys but also the depths of what it means to bump up against each other, and what it means to live in community, and what it means to even just live in relationship to oneself. Like it is hard work, and I think in an age of instant gratification, like that's why so many people fall off from it, right? Because it's not sexy.
Absolutely.
Like the reality
It's
is
not.
work is not sexy, and like the way that wellness as an industry has now been somewhat co-opted in terms of like, like it's only love and light and like da 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 da. Like, no, in my experience, spirituality is messy as hell, because it really is going to force you to look in the mirror and like decide like why there are elements of kind of like heaviness or darkness or like discontent or dis-ease, like not like illness, but like dis-ease within your body. And so trying to establish a level of integrity where it's like your mind feels clear, your soul feels clear, you know what I mean, you're emotionally healthy, is a lot of work because it forces you to confront the things that we are taught are taboo.
Right. And bringing materialism back into that. I always love when you use the word agency. There
It's my jam.
is there's
My
a
jam.
possibility for us to, if you don't have that crystal, if you can't afford that crystal or that retreat or that bath or that, whatever's going on, you're in the depths of your healing process. This is where you're supposed to
Mm-hmm.
really engage with what you're capable of. And it's so funny that we are still having this conversation of going inward and having these intimate conversations with ourselves, being taboo when that was the whole 2020 experience.
Totally.
Like, you were locked in your house, you had nothing else but what is going on around you, and choosing the bravery of an alternate path was what everybody was called to do. And
Totally.
what's funny is there was a government shutdown briefly before that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was like a year or two before 2020. It might have been just the year before. Anyway, where people were, they had to go into work but weren't getting paid.
Yeah,
And when that happened, it was the same call, but it was on a lighter scale.
totally.
Choose the alternate path. You see, this is a false
Mm-hmm.
sense of security. If how you feel right now, magnify that for change.
Totally.
And some didn't heed it, and then ushering into 2020, it was like, yeah, okay, here we are again, magnified.
Totally.
Now that the magnifying glass is on you, what isn't working, reconnect, do what you need to do. And this is where sort of materialism trips me up, is that um, sometimes you don't have the bandwidth
Mm-hmm.
to take that inward journey, and that's okay. There's space for
Mm-hmm.
everything. you
Yeah.
know if you realizing that you have the agency but you don't have the energy
Yeah.
is a real place to sit in. And at that point, collecting your tools
Mm-hmm.
is a way of supporting you. But it does get to a place where it's kind of like, okay, you've just been collecting things, but you haven't actually been doing the work.
Totally.
I this morning, as I was preparing for this conversation, I was thinking about how in indigenous cultures, when you had medicine people, typically when you went to them, you saw they had like a buttload of stuff just everywhere. It wasn't pretty on a shelf, and
Yeah.
like, and if you looked at it, you'd be like, how do you find anything? But then you
Exactly.
go to them, and they're like, no, let me go into
Exactly. And they
this
know. And
corner.
they know.
And they know exactly where it is. They know exactly what they're looking for. And I was reminded of how when we connect naturally with material objects or material items,
Mm-hmm.
if you allow and this sounds so cheesy as I say it out loud, but as you allow your heart to kind of drive that force,
Yeah.
you'll be connected to the energy of the thing, and then you'll be drawn in the direction of the thing. This is the
Totally.
case if you go into spiritual shops, you go into a store, whatever the case is. You don't have to engage in the, oh, I need this particular thing because everybody has it. You can go, what's right for me in this moment, as I don't have the bandwidth to do the work that I
Mm-hmm.
know that I need to do. And so let me, drift towards this object. For instance, if you Google crystals that are good for making decisions, and I always go back to crystals because I'm like the self-proclaimed crystal lady. So
I think so.
if you Google like crystals that are good for energy and good for making decisions, your carnelian's probably going to come up.
Mm-hmm.
And I respect that as far as like what the collective has decided carnelian is good for and how people have worked with it and been able to replicate that energy. And so that's how you get the meanings
Mhm.
in instances where you get something like that. For me, it's fire quartz, which is hematite and quartz mixed together.
Mm.
And it has always been, but
Yeah.
it took me stepping away from this material idea that I needed this thing that everybody has that has
Yeah.
always helped to, you know, what
What is
supports
my
me in
thing?
this moment, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not about like when we are talking about taking agency
Mhm.
of ourselves, it is to say, when we ask what we need, in my example, carnelian is supposed to give you energy when you're depleted.
Yeah.
For me, when I'm having trouble making decisions, it's because of my ADD. And so being grounded would serve me
Yeah.
better. So something that gives me more energy is going to throw me off course.
Totally.
Something that brings me back into my body, has me feel grounded, but still has the element of divine connection the way that quartz
Totally.
does is going to serve me better. But it takes that inward journey to even begin the conversation of what works.
Oh my God. No, totally. And there are so many responses I have to that. So hopefully it's not going to be linear. It's going to be, I'm going to pop around a couple, but
We're
like,
going.
oh,
All right, I'm in the car. Buckled
here we
up.
go. No, really. So it's buckle up now, buckle up. And so it's like, well, first, going back to, and I'm going to tie it all together, I promise, but like going back to like COVID, we're in the house, da 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 da. Like my response to COVID maybe was anxiety ridden, but like it was really like, why I chose to be a complete hermit. As you know, I took a sabbatical of a year and was like,
Same.
clearly we're being nudged to spend some time in some stillness. And so my argument to myself, because I'm like coming out of a legal tradition, right, was like, why disrespect the version of you that has survived the world crumbling, by reverting back to the world that we just watched crumble? Like, why?
Wow.
Instead, like the silver lining would be like, be able to sit in the stillness, use the stillness so that you come out of it at least feeling like there was some return on this very collective investment. Like that was like the first thing. And I think that like, the thing about materialism is like, to your point, like it's in addition to like giving something else power over how you feel and whether or not you feel validated, there's something that's very like visual to it, and like it's like it's more so about a presentation, right? And I think that like the loss there is like it's about kind of like trying to like make everything look neat, like social media, you know what I mean? And it's like, well, like really the proof is in the pudding. Like the details, the mess of it is actually what we need. Like, similar to
Right.
like you talk about like the lotus mud, like you need that dark kind of like humid situation where it's like not that cute, because that is actually not only where like the nourishment of kind of like emotional maturity and spiritual maturity lives, but it's also where our deepest opportunities to connect live, and so it's like we're just so deprived of not only opportunities to connect with one another, but materialism also deprives us of it. It distracts you from pivoting back towards yourself,
Absolutely.
and so I think that like, whether or not you're like, okay, like, do I need the cookie cutter approach? Do I need the carnelian? Just because that's what everybody's saying. Like, you're missing the point. The point is, you better way to put it. My definition of success is creating a life that reflects your understanding of self. Right? Like people they
Nice.
say it's like the house, the car, it's the whatever. No, but it's like creating a life that works for you. So like for me, it's like now I like to work from home. You know what I mean? Like I don't like to wear suits. And if I show up to an office, I'm gonna probably have ripped jeans on with my little like, pedigreed little self. Like, you know what I mean? Like and a gold lip, you know what I mean? I might have a little too like Bantu knots. Like, you know what I mean? Like I just like that's my vibe. But like the ability to kind of create a life that reflects your level of self-understanding allows you to live in a space of peace, in a space of like presence, even when a lot of different things are going on. I work in politics right now, right? So it's like a very noisy space. And so like being a spiritual person in the culture of politics is
Oh boy.
counterintuitive, right? Because it's very fast paced. It's very kind of like, what can we make this look like? How do we kind of, and so I think that like I think a lot about the conversation that we're having politically versus what I feel the conversation should be. And
Okay.
instead of getting deterred or feeling kind of discouraged by the fact that obviously our larger political conversation isn't really going well, I have found a lot of empowerment in just being able to impact myself and my immediate context, especially because I work in spaces that touch a lot of other spaces. And so it's like, I'm not going to change all of politics. However, my hope is to introduce more agency and introduce like the idea of an alternative to myself and to the people that like who work for me. Right. So even just culturally, like the team that I run, like I am very intent on not having a traditionally political team. I'm intent on, making sure that the culture is like, yeah, like people say work-life balance, and that's true, whatever. But it's more so about conditioning people to figure out how to advocate for themselves. But like
Mm,
not just speaking up because that's what I want you to do, but speaking up on something that is actually true for you. You know what I mean? Like doing that work and trying to like understand that like if we don't understand our own needs, it's going to be hard to forecast out what other people's needs are. And like right now, like what we've been
absolutely.
doing hasn't been working. And so, it's about how you show up in your own life and how you show up in the spaces that you touch, and being able to energetically understand that like you imbue everybody with a version of you. You linger in rooms. You honestly sometimes arrive before your physical body has. You know what I
Oh,
mean? And
yes.
so understanding the responsibility of that is huge, because like we are, regardless of what we want to say, we're highly emotional and energetic people. So it's like a lot of these decisions, even if it's Trump, a lot of it comes from a psychological disposition of somebody whose ego and feelings get bruised. You know what I mean? And so like
Right.
understanding the emotional connectivity that we have to each other and the mental power that we have in terms of what our engagements look like is huge, because you can have a much larger impact by virtue of how you make people feel, and by virtue of the way that you model how you feel about yourself, even and most especially in instances where you are an imperfect person.
Right. And what I love is that this is how you get past the materialism, because even in the crystal discussion that I'm having, it's not the crystals that imbue you with the power, it's what they amplify you inside
Totally.
of you, like you already have those things inside. And when you learn the depth of your emotions and the depth of who you are in proximity to other people, like you said, it allows you to see more of who they are,
Totally.
and to carry those relationships forward instead of engaging in the and this is somewhat of a material thought to say, is this right, is it wrong, the the you transcend that by saying, okay, this is how deep and how far I can go emotionally, and this person is either matching that, teaching me,
Mhm.
I'm learning in this experience, and it's all energy, it's all connected. And you know how can I work with this, and how do I want to,
Totally.
and balancing those things out also helps you transcend that materialistic thinking.
No, 100%. And I think the other thing about materialism and just like the world that we live in is that we live in the binaries where it's like either or. Where in
Yep.
fact the world is really a both and. And so like when we have a
Yes.
conversation like this where it's like, how do you show up as a spiritual person in a material world? Like what I don't want to communicate to people is that those two things are mutually exclusive, right? Like
Exactly.
reality is like you can still like things. You know what I mean? Like you can still, want to live, a life that affords you certain types of flexibility or whatever. Like it's not wrong to want those things for yourself, and it's not wrong to be able to take advantage of things like that. Like I don't want to send that message. It's more so about like the extent to which you assign these things the validity
Yes.
over your life, and the extent to
Exactly.
which you're intentional about drawing things into you that help you to live a more kind of like settled, expanded version of you. You know what I mean? Because you're like, you know what, I like, like for example, I spend my money like on Dahlia.
You're so funny.
For example, you know what I mean? But because I can draw a straight line between like my intention to continue cultivating a deeper version of myself and like the next version of myself, and living from a place of like, what does the future Kristin want? You know what I mean? And not like, oh,
Right.
like, 35, 45, 55-year-old Kristin, not that, but like, what does she feel like in terms of the way in which she's able to stand within herself? You know what I mean? And so it's like, that is how I decide how to allocate my money. Like, it's like, do I want to travel because I want the IG pics? You know what I mean? Or do I want to travel because I just want to experience that sense of awe when you're looking over a landscape and you're just like, nobody but God, spirit, the universe could like deliver on something like this. You know what I mean? So it's just really about understanding what it is that you're trying to court from these experiences and from this materialism, and understanding that like, even if you weren't allowed to get it, you would still feel a sense of wholeness even within yourself in the middle of a quarantine in a house, in a studio apartment that you haven't left in 6 months.
And I love the concept of both. I mean, for the majority of my life, I've been living in those worlds.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking the way that I do, looking the way that I do. Everything about me has been both for the entirety of my
Ada
life.
Gray.
Right. just how things are. But this space that you're talking about, even when it comes to getting the material things and whatever you imbue them with, or whatever they amplify within you, you can, and when you said you spend money on with me, the thing that you carry forward is that experience, and it isn't just drop the money and leave it,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not just buy the crystal and you have this energy for life. When you leave your house and you leave that crystal at home, when you leave my shop and you travel on with your life, you take all of that with you.
Totally.
And that is the spiritual experience.
Totally.
It's knowing that anywhere you go in the world, you could think about your tourmaline, and you don't need to have it in your pocket to absorb the negativity of all the people around you. For you having to work in the political landscape and hearing all the noise, like, it's exhausting at first, but all I can see is like opportunity, because one of the things that I love about meditation, awareness, and presence
Mm-hmm.
is learning to divide the noise, to distill
Totally.
the noise, so that you can, I mean, what this might look like first, if anybody wanted to develop a practice, is go outside and try to isolate sound.
Yeah.
So you hear this bird over there, you hear the car back there, you go through these different experiences, and that hearing experience leads you into the energetic isolation. And so when you're in the political landscape, if you need to see, if you need to focus on this one vein, but there's so many different pathways that can be taken. One of the opportunities that you can, we're not telling Kristin how to do her thing, because she does her thing. There's no mistaking that Kristin does her thing. But just as a general conversation, rather than glomming onto one political idea because it sounds good in the beginning, what we are being shown, what we are being taught, and is to learn how to see all the way down the path, instead of this candidate, this belief system, these theories make me feel good in the moment. It's, where is this leading? And this is the deeper conversation, the instant gratification, the materialism of, oh, this feels good right now, let me grab it. Because it must stay feeling good in the face of, it feels good right now, but when I feel into the depth of what it is, because I can feel in the depth of my being, because it's always an inward journey, that's not going to end well, no matter what they're saying to me right now. And we're trying to transcend that and bring that both experience of, okay, well, wait a minute, we felt the materialism. Yes, we want some relief, but also let's go ahead and take the deep dive in the journey.
But that's why, like, when I joked that, like, I'm like, I give money to you, like, you know what I mean? Like, I am absolutely a client of yours, you know what I mean? In terms of your shop, in terms of your services, et cetera. But like, it's also because I understand that, like, it is more than just our immediate interaction. You know what I mean? It is the underlying ethos and like orientation to like the conversations you're having with other people, and like trying to kind of create a different connective tissue, you know what I mean, for all of us in terms of like what the conversations can look like. And I think like I have come to a place where with everything, I tell people, I'm like, life is a series of subscriptions. You know what I mean? Like, it's essentially just trying to decide what you subscribe to. And like, you can cancel subscriptions sometimes because you're like, you know what, actually, I don't need this anymore. Like, and I think like, again, with the agency piece of like being like filling out whatever your little portfolio of life is and say, it used to be this, but now, I realize I'm actually good on that now. So we can go ahead and cancel that subscription, or we can just pause it. You know what I mean? Because I actually might need it later, but and so I think that like just trying to get to a place where you're aware of all of the subtle unspoken subscriptions that you have, like I think there's so many people who are tied in unspoken agreements to themselves and to others.
Yes.
And
Oh
like
my gosh.
getting to the bottom of those is what allows you to see like, what do I actually at this person today care about? And like also having enough compassion with yourself to know that like by 9 o'clock PM, that person may have changed and feel differently.
And the piece of unspoken agreements. I mean, that's the entire healing journey. Because you're trying to figure out where those things. I mean, they got you to a certain point. You can be grateful for them, but then it's time to evolve. It's time to shift away from them. And I think that there needs to be a conversation of impermanence.
Totally.
When you expect something to remain the same for the entirety of its existence, things invariably deteriorate. When
Totally.
there is no movement, when there's no change, when there's no
Totally.
growth, all you have is death.
Totally.
So,
And which is also like another plug for nature, right? Because like to see the intelligence of nature and to see the seasons, like fall is my favorite season, but it's just so funny because it's just like I told my little cousin, I was like, yeah, the only difference picking up leaves last fall. And I was like, yeah, the only difference between like us and these leaves is the fact that we remember our seasons. And
mm,
you would think that that would make us more optimistic about the impermanence of it all, but for some
oh
reason
no.
we're so tethered to, it's dying, you know what I mean? Like it's and it's just like I listen to a lot of Michael Beckwith, and he talks a lot about how the caterpillar doesn't even know the butterfly exists. And like that
Mm,
is like one of my favorite ideas. It's just like, sometimes you have to completely dissolve to what is in order to allow for what is to come. And I think that all of our lives, even though we've all experienced trauma and we've all experienced, high negativity and all of those things like that. But like at the end of the day, on today, even if it is a bad day, you have survived all of those things. And so it's like as empirical data, like we should feel encouraged to like have more curiosity and a little bit more trust with the way that life goes, because we're all, especially if you're willing to participate with it, because there is a role for all of us to play that is much larger than any of our vantage points will allow us to see.
right. And that growth process it's choosing, well, like you said, it's choosing a different way of being. It's choosing a new path to go down. I'm sorry for all the distractibility. I was trying to find one of these, a quote that had come to me um, a while back, and it doesn't seem to want to come up. So maybe I'm
We
not
can do part three. We can do part three.
supposed to share it. This is so crazy.
No, we
But in
good.
any case, I mean, we've traveled down this road together of materialism, being spiritual in the material world, and the concept of going out and getting the spiritual tools or getting the momentary, like the momentary thing that is going to get you onto a different path.
Mhm.
You can go and get those objects, you can go and get those things, and definitely engage with them, because again, they teach you about you. That's the entire point of living,
Yeah.
is to gain a sense of who you are. And I love, tell me, let's have your definition of success one more time,
We'll
Chris.
close with my definition of success. And I
Yes.
puppy. My success is having your life reflect an understanding of self.
Mm.
That is my definition of success.
With that, you get an opportunity to understand who you are in proximity to the material world. And the
Mhm.
material world is so much, it has its own level of spirituality, because we could be calling nature material, right?
Mhm.
Material is the density of things that you can feel.
Mhm.
And so it's important to hold that space for both. It's important to explore the depth of who you are in all of
Mhm.
that. And it's not linear, it's messy, it's heavy at times, it's light at others. And there's so many different arenas we can explore ourselves within. And if you need that stone to get you through,
Yeah.
remember that the power starts with you.
Yeah.
And then you go further. Any closing thoughts, my dear friend?
I really like this podcast. This is dope. Those are my closing thoughts.
I love having you on.
And then I think that, like, at the end of the day, the work is figuring out how to be your own best teammate,
Mm,
because then you're 100% able to navigate life in a way that feels true to your authentic self. And so I listened to a podcast the other day, and I really am going to go. Look, we'll stay here all day. We will stay here all day. I'm even going to call you after. But like, and it was about this man left medicine because he convinced a woman to participate in a clinical trial, even though she wasn't really that thrilled about it. And the reason he ultimately left medicine was because he felt like he was put in a situation where he caused someone to break with their intuition.
Interesting.
And that's why he left. And so I was just like, it is so true that, like, if people could just feel confident enough in the fact that whatever whispers you experience in your life, whether they're like your gut or like a thought or a passing judgment, whatever, like whether you're a man or a woman, like, because women always get the vibe that like they're super intuitive, but everybody has male and female energy,
Everybody.
everybody, you know. And so like getting to the point where you can trust that those suspicions that you have about there being more for you are true, then the better off we'll all be. Like, what we're encountering right now in this world is a pivot, and the opportunity to actually create a world worthy of all of us exists at our fingertips. And so it's really about believing that we have the mandate and the entitlement to do just that.
Absolutely. And I did find my quote, so I'm
Oh,
going to
yay,
say
what is
it
it?
now. Yay! Spirituality is operating by an ever expanding set of principles that asks you to look more closely at all aspects of your life,
Mm-hmm.
to live outside the confines and concepts of good or bad, or punishment versus reward, to move
Mm-hmm.
away from an external, emotional, menacing, authoritarian God and draw closer to co-creation with the divine under the auspices of personal responsibility and effort.
Mm-hmm.
That was a long time ago that came to me, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that's everything we're talking about as far as this is concerned. And I think on everything that I have ever put on the internet at all, like, we always end the conversation with "come back home to yourself." I
Yeah,
mean, very simply, where
please,
am I in all of this? So
please. Absolutely. Thank you for please have me again.
thank you. We will, girl. This might become divine
We
dialogue
should
with
just, you
Kristen
know
and
what, see,
Dahlia.
maybe we can turn into being on a podcast. Oh my gosh. Well, have a fantastic day. My love to all of you
Yes.
viewers. You guys are very wise for checking in, and I'll see you all soon.
Oh, and thank you guys for joining
Yeah.
us. And Kristen, we will see you again next time
Oh
on
my gosh.
Divine Dialogue
Amazing.
with
Take care,
Dahlia. Bye,
everybody.
guys.